Bill Dawson is our technical director here. I just want to thank you for the pictures that you shot in the last 5 minutes that you just sent me.
Why are you on your phone?
Well, because I got a message from you. I thought you were going to tell me all this doesn't work anymore or something. Dan Blackburn. After this, I'm going to ask for those of you who want to come up and speak about 1968. But I know Dan has a story.
Well, everybody's talked about what happened at the Ambassador Hotel, and I'm not going to dwell on that a great deal. Let me just, for background, say that I covered Robert Kennedy from the day he ran for the Senate in New York, and pretty much followed his footsteps all the way through to Arlington. But over the years, over those few years, Bob and I became very good friends. And I spent quite a bit of time at their home at Hickory Hill with the kids and their big dog, Brumus. So I'm going to look at a couple of the lighter sides. Brumus was the biggest dog I think I almost ever saw. Big black dog, and everybody knew that if Brumus was in the car, you didn't put your hand on the car unless you wanted to lose it, because Brumus was fiercely protective of Bob. Then Halloween came around one year, and Brumus was at the front door. Brumus, when the family was all around, was gentle, sweet, and the kids would ride on him, the whole thing. So people are knocking at the door periodically, and Brumus is ignoring them. And then this very young child, probably, if I recall correctly, was about 5 years old, comes up to the door to pick up, whatever they were handing out. At that very moment, Brumus yawned. And it must have looked to that child like a monster. I mean, that big mouth of his slowly opening, and all of those teeth. And so the kid screamed and ran back to his parents, and Ethel came out and wanted to know what had happened. So she went down and assured her that Brumus didn't bite, didn't eat small children, the whole thing. Then jumping ahead a ways, after we got to Arlington National Cemetery in June of '68, we were walking up, I was walking with Larry O'Brien, and then we got on the press bus. And all of you know that on a situation like that, the press bus goes where the candidate goes, no matter whether the candidate's living or dead. So we got on the press bus, and there was this guy in this big limousine with drivers who wanted to pass us. And it turned out that it was Lyndon Johnson with his Secret Service crew. And we decided, not gonna happen. We are going to be the lead vehicle. And Johnson's people, they're honking the horn. We got a Secret Service agent comes up to the bus and tries to stop it, and we wouldn't let the driver stop. And finally, Dick Drain, who was Ted Kennedy's press secretary and a terrific guy, jumps out of the bus, runs over, makes the limo, the presidential limo, come to a complete halt, and then Humphrey was in the backup limo. So there's two limos forced to come to a complete halt because Dick would not move. He just stood in front of them until our bus was completely cleaned and past them. And then he ran back and jumped in the front, the door on our bus, and we were all applauding like crazy. And it turned out, I've never seen that story actually anywhere written or reported, but it was a terrific moment that I always have in my memory. One other thing, partly involving Kennedy, but also Martin Luther King. We got word on the campaign that Martin Luther King had been shot. We did not know what his condition was. We were flying into Indianapolis. Bob was going to address a big rally in downtown Indianapolis in one of the black neighborhoods. And when we arrived at the airport, somebody, I don't remember who, somebody on the ground, came over and told us that Dr. King had died. So we go to the rally, campaign rally, and clearly they had not heard that anything had happened. They had no access to news. Bob gets up and tells them that Dr. King has been shot and died, and then delivers a speech that was incredible. And when he finished, he said, "Please go to your homes and behave," basically. And it was the first time ever that he talked in public about the death of his brother, President Kennedy. Indianapolis was the only major city in the country where there was no rioting. None at all. Which was pretty remarkable under the circumstances. After that, we flew to Washington. Today, all the campaigns stopped and everything came to a standstill. So we flew back to Washington, and the next day, I decided that I wanted to see what was happening up on Capitol Hill. So I got in my car, and I had my Capitol Hill pass, so I wasn't worried about anybody stopping me or anything. I drive up there, and this has never left my mind. On the Capitol grounds, looking out over DC, were machine gun nests. And the thought, these guys would be shooting Americans if they came up Capitol Hill without permission. And just that image of a machine gun nest, several actually, on the grounds of our Capitol, looking out over Washington, I've never been able to get that out of my mind. And I never saw much written about it either. Even the Washington Post didn't have much on that. But I thought I would share that image with you all as well.
Again, Dan Blackburn, thank you very much. Dan is the author of the Book of Presidents and Predators, and he's selling copies in the back of the room. And back there as well, you'll find my friend Ken Davis, who wrote In Bed with Broadcasting, also selling copies of the book. So both of those are available, and commend them to you. I'm sure there's some other folks here before we switch topics who would like to speak. Arnie, can you wriggle out of there? This would be Arnie Friedman. You should know that Arnie was we go back a few years, he was my sports editor when I was editor of the Valley State Sundial, Valley State now being CSUN. So we've known each other for a little bit. Arnie?
Yes, Bob, the three Bobs are here, the ones I know longer than anyone in this room, Bob Tarlow and Bob Rawitch and Bob Poole. We all worked together at Valley State Sundial, as Bob Tarlow just mentioned. My connection to the Kennedy assassination and the ambassador came years later. Actually, I was a reporter in '68 for Santa Monica's Evening Outlook, but I covered City Hall at that time. I didn't get into politics until a bit later. But, my old friend Pete Noyes, I was a newspaper reporter for about 25 years. And along the way, Pete and I would compete from time to time and got to know each other. So when I finally left the Daily News, after being kind of burned out after more than a decade there covering crime, LAPD, sometimes synonymously, and a lot of law enforcement stuff, I decided to make a crossover into television news, and Pete was the guy that allowed me to do so. And so I spent about 3 years working for Pete and working with some good local television news reporters at Channel 4, John Marshall, Patrick Healy, Laurel Erickson, David Garcia, I believe. And it was a good door opener for me to get into it, and then I was able to break into bringing stories to the network news magazine shows, which I did for about a decade or so, mostly in the 90s. During that time, I came across kind of an odd story that involved the Kennedy assassination, and it was a libel suit. But when I got to the story, which was at the appellate level, it was a strange bedfellows story. This involved a famous picture that was taken on the podium when Kennedy was giving his victory speech. And right next to Jess Unruh was a photographer from Pakistan. His name is Khalid Hawar. He had a yellow sweater, and he was just taking pictures of the victory speech. When it was over, he went into the ballroom, and Kennedy went backstage into the pantry, and the fade occurred. Oh, I forgot to mention the Boris connection. I got to know Boris Yarrow while I was working with the Daily News. We would meet at various crime scenes, and he often would come into the Daily News newsroom and fraternize with us. Very outgoing, much more into hard news than most photographers that I had met over the years. So Boris and I had a connection that dated back to probably the late 70s. I hadn't seen him in years, but when I got into this strange bedfellows stories, about 97, I guess it was, I thought that it would actually make for a good 60 Minutes story, because lo and behold, the friend of the court briefs were being filed in that libel suit by the LA Times, the New York Times, all three networks. All of the bastions of mainstream journalism were in bed with the Globe tabloid that was appealing this crazy libel case, in which a photo of this Khalid Hawar on stage with Kennedy was identified as the actual assassin of Kennedy. And it became a rather famous libel suit that Hawar won, because he had nothing to do with it. You know, it began as a book. A crackpot conspiracy theorist wrote this book with the picture and identifying Hawar as the actual assassin. And it was supposed to be some cockamamie conspiracy theory that involving the Iranian secret police and CIA made no sense. There was no evidence. And yet, the Globe not only published it, but seemed to be in line with it. They provided nothing from Hawar or his attorneys, and it just went without any, there was no objective discussion of it. So, and the Globe, when they lost the libel suit, they tried to defend in the appeal through this rather novel principle that allows for printing news that comes along like it'd be a wire service story without checking it out, called neutral reporting. Well, the mainstream the networks and the Times, both New York and LA Times, I think Newsweek was in on it, all felt that they needed to safeguard that principle. And so they were filing friend of the court briefs. So at that point, I pitched the 60 Minutes through the producer I was working with at that time, Marty Galovic Palmer. She was handling the LA stories. And she brought it to Mike Wallace. And Wallace loved the story. He especially liked the idea of going up against the CBS hierarchy. And we started on the story. And it was coming along fine. But the usual interview of Kawar, which would be where he lived at that time. He actually, once he became a citizen, after a few years of working in engineering, he became a farmer in Bakersfield. So both Marty and I thought, well, it's going to be colorful to get the pictures of him as a farmer up there. Mike Wallace didn't want any part of that. His idea was, let's go to the Ambassador where it happened and interview him at the scene. And by that time, I had lined up Boris to go, to be interviewed for the story for his pictures. And so the only problem with shooting it at the Ambassador, I don't know if Brian ran into that in '68, but the Ambassador was closed when we, not 68, you were there in '98, didn't you say? Okay. And we were there probably about the same time, maybe '99 by the time it got around to it. The Ambassador was closed down. And Marty was trying to find out who owned it. And lo and behold, it was owned by Donald Trump. And Mike said, well, I know him. And Mike Wallace knew everybody. He said, I'll call him, see if he'll let us in. And sure enough, this time, there was no enemy of the people stuff going on. This was, he played a behind-the-scenes role, too. But he opened the doors for us, and we did the interviews. And Mike Wallace interviewed Boris Yarl right at the scene of the shooting in the pantry, and that became an important visual for the story. And Kawar himself was interviewed in the side room, and both of them were quite emotional. Boris has shed more light as the years have gone by about why, as he said today, he really hated that, made him sick to see the photos that he shot of Kennedy. There was a lot of strong feelings. But it was very interesting that a story about a crackpot conspiracy theory didn't seem to make any headway with Trump. He was kind of an unsung hero in that story. But in fact, probably this weekend I'm going to write something about it, since I never really got into the Trump part of it. So that's about it.
Chuck Christman, is a special honor to have him here today because he helped make news 11 years before the year that we're talking about, in 1957, and he is today one of the last surviving members of the 101st Airborne Unit that in 1957 descended on Little Rock, Arkansas. And you know the rest of the story. And for those of you who are too young to know, that involved the desegregation of Little Rock High School, done under tremendous protest by those involved. President Eisenhower federalized the National Guard, and the 101st Airborne was ordered in at about the same time. Chuck is one of the last survivors there. Would you like to come up? Say a few words.
September 24th, 1957, I was deployed to Little Rock, me and about 900 other guys. To put 10 students in high school, only 9 of them graduated, but that's another story. When we boarded the planes, I thought we were going to Lebanon because we had just trained for Lebanon. And I was a little disappointed, but that's the Army. I was there 54 days. I walked patrols around the school. I was in front of the school. I kept people moving. Those that were in the military knew we did what we were told to do. And that's what I did. A little high note, a side note on the Kennedys, the commanding general of the area General Walker was shot at by Lee Harvey Oswald prior to popping JFK. I don't know if you knew that, but there's a lot of little stories that need to be told. My highlight of the whole thing was Halloween 1957. We put on a benefit, a little thing for an orphanage in North Little Rock. And we invited them over where we were at Camp Joseph T. Robinson. And we enticed the little boys, 7, 8, who knows. We told them they could shoot the machine guns. So they came on. In the Little Rock thing, I enlisted a private, and I got out of corporal, but I knew that was significant, that nobody had ever held a bayonet on Americans before. Well, I was wrong. And after World War I, the veterans marched on Washington, and they put machine guns up to do something. And as lo and behold, the one in charge of that was a lieutenant or a colonel named Eisenhower. And I didn't hear, one of the speakers said we had machine guns in Washington. I didn't know that. So whatever it is, it is. I have a bunch of pictures. I donated my whole collection to the 101st Museum. I had about 28 pictures, 9 by 12s, never seen. I had them for 50 years before I donated them. And the reason I donated them, what am I going to do with them? And my kids had seen them. And the way I got them, when I got back to camp, we had a mass jump. 600-700 people in the air. And I'm coming down, fat, sassy, and happy. And somebody goes through my shoe. Well, I reach out and I grab their canopy. This is what you do. We were trained. This is what you do. Well, he hit the ground, I hit the ground, and he was all beholden to me. I didn't do anything. Did what I was trained to do. He was a PIO photographer for the battle group. And I said, you have any pictures of Little Rock? He said, yeah, I was going to throw them away. I said, no, give them to me. That's how I got them. Okay, on the internet, there are some of the students, some of the photos and all that. At the bottom it says, photos by Chuck Chrisman. Well, it wasn't me. Chuck Chrisman had an M1 and a bayonet. I didn't have a camera. I got credit for him. Intermittently, in the past, I go speak at high schools, and the younger people don't know the history of their nationality or their race, or it's pretty important to know what's going on in the world. And there's so much knowledge in this room. I'm humbled by it. I'm humbled by getting to put my word out about Little Rock to you folks. It's a lot of things went on, but nothing bad. I got out of that. I got a letter of accommodation. Big deal. Yeah, it means I didn't get caught doing anything bad. But I'm proud to do that. My sister and wife are here. And obviously, I'm not a public speaker. So thank you.
Chuck Chrisman, thank you very much. Chuck had been in contact with me, was interested in what we did. He lives in Mojave, but he really wanted to come down and be with the Geezers group, so he did. Hello, Les. I want to thank all of you for coming. This was a special program because it looked back on history, and so many of us were involved in so many different ways in 1968. And I think for my son David, who certainly wasn't around in 1968, this was all a bit of a learning experience and kind of a look back in history in a very special way, hearing from some of those who were very intimately involved in covering the big stories of that year. So I thank you all for participating. I thank my wife Barbara for being here. And I'd like to ask you, as usual, to return the badges. Please remember that the next Newsgazers lunch is Saturday, November the 10th, and we will have, again, a student panel from Pepperdine and maybe from CSUN or other places. Dr. John Beaupre, if you would, where's Dr. John? If you would like to bring a couple of Cal State LA students here, John is a full professor of journalism at Cal State LA. They would be more than welcome, and we'll talk. We'll see whether we can get maybe a half a dozen really energetic students. And the basic idea is they ask you questions, career advice, life lessons, all the rest of it. We did a bit of a sampling of it at the last meeting. It went well, so I thought we could make a full program out of it. On Saturday, February the 2nd, 2019, our first meeting of 2019, again, we will be saluting the 50th anniversary of Eyewitness News, particularly at KABC TV. And some of the folks that, like Adrian, still working at KABC, of course, and many others in this room have been through there at one time or the other. And I would love your stories. I thank Steve for suggesting it, which was really a good one. Still in the back of the room, we got our two authors back there, Ken Davis and Dan Blackburn, selling their books. And again, we have the room till 3, so we're going to need to pack up and get out of here by 3 o'clock so that the 100-member force wedding can come in. And for some of you who haven't been here for a long time, Jilla walking along there, Bob Rowich, and you know who the rest of you are. Whenever I start doing this, I start leaving out names. Thank you for coming. Thank you all. This is always an absolute treat to have you all here, and this is our 8th year of the Newsgazers. And finally, I wish you a safe drive home and a good rest of 2018. So long.
Hold on, taking video.
Always stressing, so it's good to see you, Ryan.
Nice to see you, Lizzie.